as well.
Well.
And I asked her to present her work just to get in touch. She's also interested in what we do here in the lab. I think there will be people connected online, and as usual, we will record and share on our YouTube channel the seminar. The format here usually that's our visitors speaks around 40 minutes.
Okay.
Which is the idea, 30, 40 minutes, and then we have a debate. And if you want to join us for lunch, normally we have a collective lunch.
Okay.
After the same.
Perfect.
Okay. So the floor is yours.
Perfect.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I come from the law department, so maybe it's a bit. I've tried to make it very much less legal, but it will be kind of. I'll touch on some of the regulations. But I've been in Vigo for the past month or so, looking at the fishing sector here. I'm doing my PhD mainly on labour law, and I'm looking at the just for law. Drop and no, it seems that
Use the other.
I've never managed to.
It doesn't work. It's very. Post with post canvas. Canvas with A. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're back. I don't know if you can hear us. Hopefully, yes. Okay, perfect. Okay. So yes, I'm doing my PhD at the moment. I'm in my year, looking at kind of a comparison between Ireland and Spain for both of those sectors. So now I'm doing fieldwork in Vigo. I've been talking to different trade unions. Yesterday I spoke to ship owners, and I've been kind of moving around Galicia to talk to different people and their views on what a just transition is, what the blue economy is to them. And yeah, I'll talk a bit about that at the end. And then I'll be back in Spain in January to look at the agriculture sector and migrant workers there. What I'm going to do today is kind of present a paper I've already published, but I've kind of expanded it. And then I'm going to reflect on Vigo and how I think a bit differently maybe about that paper. A lot of my research here has looked at migrant workers, but this paper is just kind of a general overview of the fishing sector. So to start, my interest in this sector began right at the start of my PhD when two Spanish boats, they were owned by Spanish companies, but they had German flags, and they were detained in Irish waters off of the kind of waters of West Cork, so Southwest Ireland, by the Irish Navy, and they were escorted into the port town of Castletownbere, which I've now found out in Galicia they call Castertown. So they all have their own names for all our Irish towns. So they were escorted in, they were detained in the port there for illegal fishing practices. So they left the nets in the water for too long. And they were charged with that. And during the time in which they were charged and brought to court and did all those proceedings, there was an Indonesian crew on board who were not allowed to disembark. They had not been paid their wages. They had contracts that didn't align with what they were told they would get. And so the trade unionist that I knew told me that he had to go down there and figure out what was going on. But the Irish authorities weren't allowed to board the boat. The legislation didn't allow them to board the boat. So for me, I was really struck by this disjuncture between kind of our ability to regulate the environment and kind of illegal fishing practices, however strong they may be, and the inability to regulate labour violations. So why do we have this disjuncture between the two when we should be looking at the environment as something that also includes workers? So that's kind of where this whole interest in fishing started. And so in the paper, the first kind of overarching question I ask is, what does the kind of recent proliferation of this idea of sustainability, so you hear it everywhere in the fishing sector, what does it mean for people who actually work in the sector? And then also kind of connecting that to the just transition. So what does a just transition mean for people who are actually employed in the sector? And the main arguments that I make are kind of, despite sustainability's increasing prominence in the sector, the prevailing understanding is really narrowly defined. They understand sustainability as fishing within the biophysical limits that are set by scientists, and as long as you don't kind of go past those limits, then that's sustainable. They don't think about sustainability a bit more holistically in terms of social and economic sustainability. And this is at the cost, so it kind of excludes alternative, more comprehensive approaches that would allow us to kind of facilitate a departure away from this fixation of kind of operating at the limits, kind of perpetual efficiency, and this idea of green growth that has kind of started to dominate that idea, that narrative on just transition. And there's also kind of space, and I'm trying to look into that in the legislation, for a better convergence of the social, environmental, and economic spheres within this concept of sustainability. I was very critical of it previously, but maybe there is space, because it is so prominent in the fishing sector, to use that legislation and use the provisions in the different regulations to kind of expand on it. But there's a lot of limitations to that, and one that kind of centres workers and their labour and social rights. In terms of the academic and policy significance, I know many of you are far more aware of this field than I am. In labour law, the just transition kind of scholarship is very new. They have been quite critical. A lot of the literature is very critical of the historical role of labour law in regulating that separation of labour from nature. So labour law was really crucial in making sure that people kind of were removed from the land and then brought into factories, and then it kind of was born in this industrial revolution time. And it's been used by workers to kind of revolt against employers, but it's also been used to kind of define how we understand work and what counts as work. So now there's kind of a movement within labour law to look at how labour law can be used to redefine our relationship to nature, but also kind of rethink what we define as work and what we protect as work in legislation. And within that, people have been generally very critical of this concept of sustainability, but scholars more recently have said, look, it's in so much of this legislation. Is there an opportunity to kind of expand on it and reshape that narrative on sustainability? Fisheries, so I chose to look at fisheries because it's a sector in which labour and nature are very closely intertwined. And the impacts of climate change are very clear. Like, it's very clear that because fish are migrating to different areas, people have to go out for longer periods of time into deep waters, facing a lot more storm. Working conditions are becoming a lot more difficult. And then it's also kind of important to question the priorities that we're currently seeing in this concept of sustainability and the narrow consequences of this idea of fishing at the biophysical limits of that we've constructed. So what I'm going to do today is kind of a definition generally of a just transition, and then its relationship that I see to sustainability. And then secondly, I'll look at fishing and employment legislation. I won't go into too much depth because I won't kill you by law. And then lastly, I'll do a few reflections from my time in Vigo. So in terms of kind of just the general scholarship, again, many of you are very aware of this. There's very many definitions of a just transition. They vary in terms of scope and scale, and then also kind of the extent of transformation that's being pursued. So some people use it as this concept of green growth, whereas others are kind of calling for this kind of radical overhaul of the economic system. Within labour law, there's a real concern that the worker origins of the term are being lost, that everyone's kind of using this term of just transition, when really it emerged from trade union movements in the 1970s and 80s, who wanted to push that relationship between work and the protection of the environment. So there's kind of this kind of pushback, at least within labour law. I'm sure elsewhere, I'm just mainly familiar with the labour law literature, to bring back the worker origins of the term. And so in my PhD, and maybe it's a bit of a cop-out and taking the easy route, but instead of creating a definition of a just transition, I just look at two core properties that I think are important, and that's labour and addressing inequality. and two simple things, and looking at how legislation potentially addresses that. Then if we kind of look at sustainability, generally understood as having three pillars: economic, environmental, and social. So yeah, labour law, I said labour law scholars have been quite critical of this, but I really want to use it because it's very important in other fishing regulations. And I'll talk about that now in the next slide. I don't know if anyone here works on fishing by chance. Okay, well then I'm not gonna.
I'm really into fishing.
Okay.
Just as a hobby.
Okay. Then you can't question my legislation. So the common fisheries policy is the main kind of EU piece of legislation on this. In the Treaty of Rome, so 1957, this kind of foundational EU time, no one really cared about fishing. Like, it was a very kind of local industry. It was subsumed in legislation under the umbrella of agriculture. So if we regulate agriculture, part of that is fishing, but it was very much kind of local fishing towns and villages. But then in 1982, we had the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So that's when you start to see the privatization of waters around countries, the creation of exclusive economic zones, EEZs. And so states are kind of starting to define where they can fish and who's not allowed to enter their waters. And so in the EU, we have the first kind of common fisheries policy then in 1983. Spain at the time and Portugal were looking to join the EU, were joining it. And there was a lot of fear, certainly from Ireland and the UK, that Spain and Portugal were going to come into their waters and start to take their fish. Spain and Portugal have far more advanced kind of fishing industries compared to those two countries. So there was a bit of tension within the EU at the time. So they said, fine, we're going to create this common fisheries policy and start to regulate fishing and how many fish you can catch. And so currently, so it's gone through several kind of reforms, and the current one we have is the one from 2013. And if you look at the very first CFP in 1983, there are no references to this idea of having sustainable fish stocks or anything like that. But if you turn to the legislation in 2013, there's now 70 references to sustainability or sustainable fish. And basically, the common fisheries policy sets quotas for each member state. So each member state has a quota of fish that they're allowed to catch, and they're called TACs, so total allowable catch. And they're kind of set by scientists. They're set at EU levels, so none of the fishermen, and this is what I found a lot in Vigo, there's a lot of frustration that there's no mechanism to influence discussions at EU level. They're set at EU level, and then they're passed down to national level, and then the national level allocates that quota there. And it's based on this idea of a maximum sustainable yield, so an MSY, and that's on scientific advice. They don't consult people who live in the communities. It's all just like monitoring fish based on surveys of fishing numbers in certain waters. So it's a very kind of scientific approach to fishing that many have criticized as like a very, like the epitome of a neoliberal approach to understanding sustainability. Within this CFP regulation, it has one of its objectives, to manage fishing activities in a way that is consistent with the objectives of achieving economic, social, and employment benefits. So it says that that's one of its objectives, maintaining sustainable fish stocks, but also taking care of social and employment benefits of those who work in the sector. But then when you actually look at the legislation, there's nothing in there to actually support people who work in the sector. There's little development of this idea of social sustainability. Fishers are understood as kind of market actors. So you can have this many fish stocks, you sell them on the market, but if there's not enough fish, then that's your problem. Like, you can fall back on social welfare potentially, but we're not going to talk about that in this regulation. So what some scholars have described is this idea from the early 1980s of a fisherman who's kind of a local person who operates in a system of the commons within the fisheries in their local area, being transformed into an entrepreneur of sustainable seafood. So now they have to kind of market fish as being sustainable. You see it a lot. I'm sure you see it here as well. In Ireland, we see it a lot in this idea of buy this fish, it's sustainable, locally caught, and fresh to your door, when it's really a very big trawler off the coast. But they've had to kind of remarket themselves in order to remain in this sector. And significant numbers of people have left fishing. And at the moment, about 70% of the fish in the EU is imported. So it's really not paying attention to those who work in the sector. So what I tried to do was look into this regulation and say, okay, is there anything in there that we can potentially build on to expand this idea of social sustainability? And there is one provision, Article 17 in the Common Fisheries Policy, that regulates the allocation of fishing opportunities at a domestic level. And it says that member states can define criteria based on environmental, social and economic concerns. Member states have not really used this. It's all kind of based on historical catches. So if your company caught this many fish before, you'll get the same quota again and again. But there is space potentially to expand on that. But again, it's quite limited and it's not used very well by member states right now. They also have advisory councils. So each area within the seas around Europe are divided and they have advisory councils and they involve different kind of key actors for the sector. They are dominated by kind of these big conglomerates and kind of there are some trade unions, but very few, but they're kind of the big fishing industries that dominate these advisory councils. There's also scientists on board in the councils. But there could be space there to kind of expand who's allowed in. And then they also kind of give advice to the Commission, the European Commission, when they want to kind of set quota. So these are two places I see in the legislation to kind of expand on this idea of social sustainability, but it's still very limited, and it's still particularly limited by the fact that we're still viewing fishing as kind of how do we get as much fish as possible so that next year we have just enough, but not kind of re-questioning the system that we've already established. So that's the fishing legislation. And then completely separately, we have employment legislation. So for those who work in the sector. So if you remember those Indonesian workers on board in Ireland, the authorities were not allowed to step on that boat. And that's because Ireland doesn't participate, or hasn't ratified the Work and Fishing Convention that gives authorities permission to board the boat. But it is the main and the only international law instrument that regulates working conditions on board. So there's minimum requirements around age, around wages, medical exams, health and safety, minimum requirements around like food and accommodation that have to be provided. It's a very minimum, it's a basic floor, but it is something that they've tried to kind of create cohesion internationally. And then in the EU, so a lot of member states just weren't bothering to sign up to this. They didn't feel any pressure domestically to cooperate in it. So social partners in the EU, these are kind of, if you have to do anything related to employment, the EU has to consult social partners. So they have to consult trade unions and they have to consult employer groups. So they work together in the fishing sector, which you rarely see in other sectors. But in the fishing sector, Europesh, which is a representative of fishers, and then ITF, which is the International Transport Workers Federation, on behalf of the people who are employed, so the fishermen, the kind of the people who do the more menial work. They came together and they said, no, we have to push through a directive at EU level, which would be much stronger than the international law provision. So member states are now having to implement it. Ireland has done a very bad job. Spain has done a better job, but still quite questionable. Some of the key differences are that in the EU legislation, you can only really protect the employment rights of those people who have an employment contract. So if you are undocumented, or if you're self-employed, but a kind of a bogus self-employment, then you're not covered by the minimum working conditions. It also doesn't regulate minimum wages, because that's very much, it's a contentious issue in EU law, and also compliance and port state control. So still, even if Irish authorities wanted to board that boat that had a German flag owned by a Spanish company, all EU member states, even if the Irish authorities wanted to board that boat, that still wouldn't be allowed under the current legislation. But yeah, so that's kind of where they're going. My key interest in this is that these employment regulations have no reference to environmental sustainability or any kind of environmental regulations. Again, conditions at sea affect your work, storms, rising temperature, all of that does affect your conditions at work, but none of that is kind of regulated or mentioned in the Work and Fishing Directive. One area, again, what I did with the fishing regulations, I also did with the labour regulations. So one thing that could potentially, and I have a few others in the paper, but one that I see is potentially allowing for a better connection between the social and the environmental, is this idea of a joint committee on occupational safety and health. So these are committees that they set up to bring in people who work on boats and skippers to talk about, the conditions at sea, what we need to do to improve working conditions, and reacting a bit better to changes in the environment. But again, there's limits to connecting that social sustainability and the environmental sustainability. Just as an update, so the EU is now kind of renewing a lot of this legislation. The biggest recent update was the Fisheries and Ocean Pact in 2023. And it came kind of after the European Green Deal, and that's where Ursula von der Leyen says there just can't be green without blue, and this whole idea of the blue economy. And I think she refers to fishers as the stewards of the sea. And there's this whole talk about, how fishermen are really important to improve our sustainable food and the provision of it. Two of the important kind of instruments there are the Action Plan to Protect and Restore Marine Ecosystems. There, they talk about supporting people in communities and coastal communities, and making sure that they have the supports there. There's a call kind of for the phase out of when the nets are kind of put right down to the sea floor and they just drag them to catch all the fish. It's very, very destructive, and they're phasing it out in MPAs, which are marine protected areas. But there's been a lot of pushback from fishermen because that's where a lot of their fish is. So it's looking at how do you kind of compensate people who are losing work, or how do you make sure that there is better kind of consultation around that. Again, it's just an action plan. There's nothing in law. So we've yet to see if member states will actually follow through. And then the second one is the communication on the common fisheries policy of today and tomorrow. So instead of reforming the common fisheries policy, so the 2013 version, they decided instead to keep it and kind of make improvements. And again, there they talk about, making the work attractive, recognizing that people aren't working in fisheries, and it recognizes workers again as essential to the health of the sea. But there's a very little concrete kind of connection thereafter to what social sustainability means and what it means to protect workers in those sectors. I feel like I spoke very fast because I'm moving on to my conclusions. But generally what I conclude in the paper and here is that the legislation currently fails to link environmental sustainability to other forms of sustainability, and our current understanding of sustainability is fishing and operating at kind of the biophysical limits of each species' ability to reproduce is just far too limited. And the current employment protections that are in place are really quite inadequate if we are going to pursue a transition, and particularly in the face of the consequences of climate change and kind of the movement of fish to kind of further waters. And there is a need kind of for a reimagination of sustainability, and also kind of better ways for people to participate and shape what sustainability means for them. And then, so I've been in Vigo since the start of October. So I think I spent a lot of time looking at the legislation and how things work at EU level. And I spent some time in Brussels last year talking to people who work at that EU level. So it's been very interesting now to look at what happens more on the ground, and the deeply critical people who work here. But when you ask them about just transition, in Brussels, it's very much associated with people who work in this sector and supporting workers. But here it's very much associated with wind farms. It's just immediately just transition wind farms. It means we're going to lose all our fishing rights. They really do not like the term with the people that I've talked to, and just don't see any connection to it. And they also see it as something that entails converting their boats to electric engines. So that's, for them, that's what the just transition is for fishing. And many of the big kind of boats that you see are built in the 60s and 70s. So putting electric engines on them is just not very feasible. But that's how they have understood the just transition so far. The blue economy, everybody talks about the blue economy. They're all very aware of kind of the EU's promotion of it, but they're very, very critical. And I was in A Coruña recently, and the kind of fishing port used to be in the center of the city, and it was kind of everything was built around fishing historically in A Coruña, but now it's been moved to the outskirts of the city, and what you see in its place are these huge cruise ships that come in and kind of luxury yachts. And someone I was speaking to there was like, this is the blue economy. That's what they mean by there just can't be green without blue. It's these big cruise ships, and then we go round the corner, hidden away, are kind of these fishing boats, all with migrant crew, all with, you know, quite poor working conditions, but that's not seen as the blue economy. It's something we hide, but we'll talk about it at EU level as, you know, fisheries as the stewards of the sea. And some people, and especially yesterday I talked to 2 women who both have fishing flotas, I don't know the word in English, which is really weird for me. Fleets, yes. They have their own fleets, and often I'm quite critical of employers. I get a bit like, oh, because I come from a labour law perspective. But they were talking about very critical of sustainability, but this idea of the cultural consumption and the need kind of for food sovereignty, and our idea to think about valuing the work that goes into, bless you, like valuing the work that goes into fishing. And they were both talking about how none of their kids have any interest in working in the sector. It's very heartbreaking for them to have to, you know, to stay passionate about it and to be kind of valued and respected in the community. When, you know, you can go into a supermarket and it's very easy to buy fish, and people don't really think about where it comes from. And then they were like, instead, at least in Vigo, there's a lot of boats that you can visit as museums along the port. And they were like, that's where our boats are going to end up, as museums, and that's about it. And a lot of my work here, I don't really talk about that in that paper or in my presentation, is on migrant workers. There's a high number in the sector, particularly on big boats. In the local kind of artisanal fisheries, there's not many migrant workers, but there are on the big boats. And there's a lack of clarity in terms of the immigration permissions that people hold. Sometimes they're not allowed to disembark because they don't hold the permission, so they have to remain on the boat. And then there's also quite a few who come on pateras, like small boats, to the Canary Islands, and then they request to come up to Galicia, and they're asylum seekers, but then they do the training here in Galicia, and they also work on the boats. But there's difficulties with their employment contracts, and the fact that their applications for asylum can be refused and then they lose work is also another issue. So it's been a very interesting time. There's a really strong connection, it seems, between Galicia and Ireland, and so that's also been nice. And a lot of the boats go between Ireland and Galicia to have their own mix of English and Spanish that they communicate with each other in. So it's been good to hear. I know it entirely, but it's been nice to be forced to reflect on my time here and present it. So thanks.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so who wants to start? I have a lot of questions here.
Oh no.
I have comments, but
Go for
I'll leave
it.
it to the end.
Okay. So who's this?
I just have a question
Yeah.
about, I'm very ignorant about when we talk the scales, fisheries, and then you mentioned 2 scales about the artisanal fishery,
Yeah.
big boats, and then you talk about people that have fleets, and like,
Yeah.
what scales are we talking about? Like Mario scale, or what are the scales that we are, but you're a fisherman, that you
Yeah,
are
I'm
not a fisher.
fishing, so it's like very.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what are the scales that we are talking
Yeah.
about in the, like?
Well, I think if I remember correctly, Spain has about 8,000 boats that are registered nationally, and then the number, so they're kind of the bigger fishing ones that are over 24 meters. There's maybe several hundred, so there's not that many. It's quite small, and it's something that people get really quite upset about. Most of them are in Galicia. I think 4,000 of the 8,000 registered boats are in Galicia alone. I don't know if you know there, but many of the kind of big ones, there's not that many. And in Ireland, we have 2,000 registered boats. So yeah, it's a small scale. I think it accounts for about, in Spain, it's about 1.5% of employment. If you're just looking at fishing, the kind of economy around it is bigger, but yeah.
I want to add something because it's kind of high historical context, because Galicia used to have one of the biggest fleets in the world.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure you know that. And when we came into the European Union, I mean, this is related also with the feeling that the fishing is going to end and the feeling of rejection of the quotas. I mean, when we entered the European Union, the fishing fleet went really down because of the quotas. And that's something inside of the I don't know how to say it, but in the idiosyncrasy of fishing villages.
Yeah.
So that's like a lost tradition, like a lost huge amount of people working there. I don't know how to translate it into English words, but you can feel it in the fishing villages.
Very much so, yeah.
And I wanted to say also because I don't think people are against scientific aspect of the quota. It's my perspective. But I think we are against the European Union because the partition of the quotas are against us, against our country. I mean, my country, I mean Galicia. But even the Spanish, the partition of the Spanish quota is against us. So people are really against those, I don't know, bad partition or unfair partition. And that's also related with that story of the fishing fleet. So that kind of thing is related to a negative sentiment around fishing. So that's one thing you have to consider to understand what is Galician fishing about.
Yeah. I think it's not, I phrased it wrong in that they're not against scientific advice. On most big fishing boats, there's always a scientist monitoring kind of how much fish is caught, and they work very well together. I think what perhaps they're more critical about is that the scientists are the only people who really have the word on what's sustainable. They're not talking to the people of they've known the fishing for decades, and instead you bring in this marine biologist who has the authority over their knowledge of the sea and fish that is not valued as much, maybe. Yeah.
Because we have like huge issues with the quotas. And if you
and in Ireland it's the exact same. Yeah, there's a lot of frustration.
If you want to study agriculture with the milking quotas, it is really crazy because we lost a lot of milk production towards France.
Yeah.
And people is like really have this feeling of rejection against the European quotas.
And I get the sense that it's real frustration with an inability to even say anything. It's just kind of, it's dictated from the top down.
Yeah.
And there's no, I think that's why labour law provides kind of these social partners and mechanisms for participation, but it's difficult to shape back up, I think. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for the chat with me. And I actually have a question. Two. One has to do a little bit with your later research on agriculture.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you're going to focus in Galicia or another geographical area.
I'm in the south, so Huelva mainly.
Let's talk if you want.
Okay.
There's this thing called PER, which might be interesting to give it a thought.
Perfect.
And the second one was related with your current research, which, first of all, congratulations, on Galician and Galician fishing trenches.
Yeah.
Because I was wondering if you're focusing mainly on big boats, or if you're also including, I don't know how you translate it into English, I think it will be cofradías.
Yeah.
Sisterhood and brotherhoods, and if their trade union dynamics are different or something along those lines. I'm just curious, huh?
I'm mainly focusing because I'm mainly looking at migrant workers, and they're mainly employed in the big kind of industrial trawlers. And those are kind of out at sea for months. So I'm very interested in how that works also legally. How do you play with international waters and the flags that you fly? But I've been trying to talk to the cofradías, but I just can't. I think maybe email is not the way to go. But like I've tried so many different ways to get in touch with them. I'm going to keep trying. But it's a very cool form of organizing that they have.
Some friends,
okay, maybe.
Might be able to meet you up.
Yeah. No, they have their own historical way of organizing and supporting each other, which I think, again, needs to be better supported. But yeah.
I have two questions. First, because I'm in my second year of the PhD, so I would like to know what was the methodology that you used to analyze the data. And the second is because you mentioned wind farms, and we had here a project about offshore wind farms and public participation.
Okay.
And we tried to reach the cofradías and they reject us, all of
Interesting.
them,
Yeah.
and they didn't come. So I don't know if you had the opportunity to talk with some fishermen and know a little bit what is their opinion about the offshore wind farms.
Not good. Methodology. So I'm just doing my fieldwork now, so I haven't actually analysed any of it. So it's just semi-structured interviews with kind of key stakeholders in the sector. And then I'll do the same in Ireland and then for both agriculture and fishing. And then it's mainly legal. So law methodologies are just like, we don't really have methodologies. But anyway, they won't tell you that. It's kind of doctrinal analysis, so looking at the legislation and what the provisions are and commenting on the implications on people. So it's socio-legal, so I combine kind of interviews and legislation. With the wind farms, there's a lot of animosity towards it, but I've been talking to a trade unionist so last week he organised a conference between people who are building wind farms and fishermen. I think I can send it on. I couldn't make it, but it was last week. And they're really trying to like start that conversation and not make it so negative and discuss ideas where like fishermen can be given certain access to certain areas and how to make sure that they have participation in where exactly they're going to be placed. But I can send on, I'm not sure, there's a whole list of different trade unions and stuff involved trying to bring the groups together. So and I can put you in contact also with the trade unions if anyone wants that. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I enjoyed the presentation very much. And I have maybe a comment and a suggestion maybe or something to think about as you were speaking. It made me think that you are keeping this distinction between work and employment? Because you seem to be focusing only on employment. Maybe like if you start to talk about work more generally, you could get into the difference between reproductive and productive work. And maybe that, you know, is this research that they're doing is also an opportunity to bring in questions about reproductive labor in the blue economy and how this is being completely overlooked. But this might be putting the cart before the horses, because we are talking here about very fundamental problems which start from compliance, basically. So we are talking about regulation, but there's not even compliance at the moment. And then we're talking about shifting regulations, and maybe another step would be to bring in all these questions about reproductive labor that are not, by definition, not considered part of employment, right? Not employment regulation, but this itself is one of these boundaries. It's a device that that generate a lot of inequalities and so maybe, I don't know, like something maybe you want to pursue further in your research.
Yeah, I would love to. I think because in law there's a difference legally between a worker and an employee is more protected, whereas a worker can also include self-employed people. So if you're an employee, you have a contract, you have stronger protections, and including on the boats, if you have a contract, you have better protection, and then there's a worker. But I would love to then go into kind of expanding what our understanding of work is. A lot of people in labour law are kind of pushing for that, and also, yes, looking at reproductive work and also looking at like care for the ocean and care for the coast and care for the environment as a valid form of work. In the fishing sector, it's a lot of women who do a lot of the repairing of the nets. So there's a lot of kind of talk about how do we count that labour. And I think in Spain, I haven't fully gone through the data, but at least in Ireland, they're starting to count unpaid labour in the data. So you can look at, they're trying to quantify how much labour is going into it, but it is unpaid. And they also do it in agriculture. So like, has your cousin come and helped you on the farm? How many hours did they work, even if it was unpaid? And then also like who's working in the home, who's doing all that kind of work. But I'd love, if I had the time, I'd love to kind of look into that and the gender dimensions of it. Yeah.
And another thing I was thinking as I was listening to your talk is whether like there is a connection between the type of technologies that are being adopted and the sort of and the treatment of labor in the fishing industry. So, for example, like I mean, I'm not very much like into the Marxist tradition, but like there is this argument that technological innovation is justified often on the basis that it allows for like not only exploitation but also like the suppression of unions and all the and organized labor. So maybe like a connection with the sort of like the type of boats, the way the technology is evolving, and the exploitation that you are seeing and the poor working conditions are more connected than maybe you are thinking about now. In the way like for example, the fishing technologies are developing. It might be part of the problem as well.
You stole my question.
Sure.
Okay. I spent too much time together, Mari.
No, because there was a new regulation that the European Union was trying to push. That was the installation of cameras on the boats.
Oh yes, yeah.
And the Galician and also Asturian or northern Spain, they're really opposed to this. Because, well, basically they want to check because there is a lot of illegal fishing as well. This was another question, maybe later. But yeah, I mean, the ecology aspect is super important.
Yeah. And I think even with more innovations, so now they have ships that come with refrigerators to offload the other fish onto, and they've all these new technologies so that they can stay out at sea for longer. So it means the workers are out there for much longer in the same conditions. And yes, with the cameras, it's the same. This kind of level of monitoring that they can justify is making sure that everything is okay, but it's just also hypervigilance of everything that's done. Yeah, I don't look into technology so much. I was also writing an article on agriculture, and someone was told me to look at the impact of AI on agriculture, which I don't even know where to start with that. Especially because a lot of the agriculture legislation is about we need broadband in rural areas, and I was like, I don't know about AI. But certainly it does seem to affect workers' rights in the sense that it allows greater productivity, and therefore workers are kind of pushed to also match that level of productivity or lose their jobs.
Yeah. Or even like the way the blue economy is being framed at the moment is like there's a lot of emphasis on technological innovation, improving you talk about the engines, but I'm sure they're talking about making many other like technological improvements on the ships to make them more eco-efficient, but maybe they want to do there are other type of technological innovations that are not meant to be make boats eco-efficient, but maybe, what Mario was saying, like a way of monitoring and surveying labor and so on. I don't know. Just
and a lot of
ideas like...
No, and there is another thing that someone mentioned to me, but I haven't explored it more, but that a lot of the new requirements have specific requirements on the size of the boat and the space that you dedicate to different areas. And kind of the smaller your boat, the lower your taxes are, the lower your fuel consumption is. But what they seem to cut, first of all, is the living conditions for the workers. So like smaller beds, smaller food and smaller kitchens, smaller kind of rest areas. So that's the first thing that they cut off because it's not very useful. So they're all kind of just put into the same room. So you do see it. It was what one of the trade unions said to me. So yeah, I will explore it a bit more.
Just a comment. Regarding the cameras, from my perspective, is also a way. Maybe you don't agree with me, but for me, from the scientific perspective, I think it's a way to protect scientific observers. So too, because there are so many disagreements between fishermen and scientific observers.
Yeah.
So I think that the possibility to analyze these captures in an anonymous way is maybe a way to protect the scientific.
And there's a huge amount of illegal fishing. Like there were surveys I got. They're all from migrant workers who were in port in Vigo, and they asked them anonymously, "Do you ever see this? Do you ever see that? Do you ever see?" And a lot of it was, no. Do you ever see illegal fishing? Always. Like it's every single survey said, I see. And like it's everything from leaving your nets in too long to going into the wrong waters. It seems to be quite rampant. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Good point, actually. Do you consider them workers? I mean, the observer, the people that go there to observe, or is that part of the
I actually don't look at them so much. The
biologists.
biologists.
the biologists, for example?
Not so much. I could look at their.
Because
I mean, it's a tough working position to be in when you're in combat potentially. But what I've heard is that they work quite well today. There's not a lot of tension, but yeah, I mainly look at people who, because of their immigration status, so that's where I start from. But yeah.
I have also like a suggestion because
Yeah.
if you're interested in migrant communities, there's a kind of it is sold as I don't know because I'm not into it, but there's a Cabo Verdean community in a northern port in Galicia, in Burela.
Yeah, I've heard about them. Yeah.
But they are really like integrated in the community.
Capo Verde.
Cabo Verdean.
They've been there for decades, I think,
Yeah.
right?
And I don't know, the government said as like an example of migrant integration. I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But at least when my wife is here, they are integrated in the community. So if you are into the social aspect of migrant work, maybe that's a case study that you could use. I don't know.
No, I'd love to go there. And when I was in A Coruña, someone was telling me about that community there and how it's worked very well. But from their perspective, yeah.
So, I don't know about
maybe
the
next
conditions
time.
or the labor-related stuff, but there's something that you could go into.
Yeah,
Because,
I'd love
for
to.
example, the Indonesians, they're like ghettoized. I don't know if that's the word, but the Cabo Verdeans are really integrated in the society.
No, I just need to come back now.
Okay. First of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. It overlaps with many of my research interests, like especially the politics of environment. So I'm still trying to understand, like you talked a bit about sustainability and then about law. But like if you talk about law, for me, the most important part is like, are you talking about constitutional law or customary law? And if it is about constitutional law, then law is all about precise definition. Everything is defined. What is meant is what has been explained in particular words. So when you see law from that perspective, it's a very different analysis of environment.
Yeah.
But when you from the legal lens, when you look at the environment or sustainability debate, how it is defined, what is included, what is excluded in defining those things. When we talk about sustainability from social perspective or social science perspective, it's a very rich debate, and there is like different lines, different positions, like, and it's a very well argued, like well accumulated literature on these things. So for me, the first question is like, how do you see it, and especially from the constitutional point of view, like rather than going into the social dimensions, it would be more interesting to see like what is defined, what is excluded, what is included, and how to do that. Like because many of the things which you mentioned, like they might be policy documents, they might not even be legislation. So like policy is not binding, whereas legislations are binding.
Yeah.
So do you want to stay within the legal debate, or do you want to go beyond the legal debate also? Because illegality and legality for me as a social scientist, it doesn't matter much.
Yeah.
Because it's just with one stroke of a pen, like whatever is called as illegal can be called legal.
Yeah.
And many of these things which are going on, like these are also the outcome of broader socioeconomic processes.
For sure.
Like fishing, agriculture, it's true for Galicia, it's true for Ireland, it's true for even like other countries, like no one wants to do agriculture. And everyone is saying the same, like with more regulations, it is becoming more difficult, but more than the environment, we are more worried about agriculture as a vocation, because it is not profitable.
Yeah.
So in this circumstance, when you bring the environmental debate, it makes someone the winner and someone the loser, and the losers are always like for whom this is the primary sector, the primary productive sector, like fishermen and others. And for the big traders and other business corporations, like these kind of regulations bring them new opportunities. So the way how environment or sustainability is defined also affects like how their vocation or work condition are going to change. So how do you want to, like, you want to stay within the legal discourse, and frame the debate in the legal discourse, where is the opportunity or how to broaden the discourse, or more broadly to engage with the broader political and economic and social questions. I think that need to, for me, like as an observer, that need to come very explicitly to help me understand where do you position your research.
I think maybe because I removed a lot of the legislation to make it a bit less legal. But in terms of the law, so all the law that I've mentioned here is all kind of written legislation. Constitution is one form, EU law is separate from that. So every country will have its own constitutional law. EU law sits above that. And then within EU law, you have regulations, which the EU can pass, and then they directly apply into national legislation. And then there's directives, which the member state then has to put into its national legislation. The common fisheries policy is a regulation. It's a very hard form of law. And member states have no say in what that is. They can negotiate it through trilogue discussions at EU level, but then regulation is directly implemented. There, they only define sustainability as sustainable yields. There's no definition within that legislation of what sustainability is. It's all about maximum sustainable yield from the fishing catch. And that's what I talk about in the paper is that's how they mention sustainability. In their objectives to the legislation, they say this piece of legislation has an objective of doing this, X, Y, Z. They mention social sustainability, but it's not defined anywhere. So that's why in my work, I'm saying it's there in hard law. We have it there. Can we use it? Can we push it can we push it further and define it and allow people to kind of use that term to potentially change how things are written? But I do come at it from a very legal perspective, but I draw on other areas. But I think for me, the only way I can contribute is through taking apart the law and looking at how it affects people. But there's certainly other ways to approach it.
If I add to this, if this is the case, then I think like one good side of analysis can be legal conflicts or judicial matters. Like how in the judicial matter, like when fishermen is fighting against the others, how in those legal cases like these things are defined.
Yeah. And I look a bit at that in the paper, but in a lot of law. Yeah, exactly. But in a lot of legislation, law is just a battle about definitions. And whoever has the loudest voice tends to win. But yeah, it's all defined through case law and legislation. Yeah.
Just last. I mean, it's not a comment or a question. It's just something that I would have enjoyed more. Like you briefly mentioned, and you just sort of assumed that we would not be interested in that debate, but we would have. Like, similar to what Aviram said, if you briefly mentioned things around like why labor law is critical to the idea of sustainability, or they have traditionally separated nature and what, we would have been more interested in that debate if you had added that.
Okay.
These are like interesting conversations to have.
Yeah. I think it's because I have a whole chapter on my PhD on that I was like, oh God, I won't bring all of that in on the law's kind of role in regulating, defining who works and all of that. It's really, really interesting. It's very new within labor law, but I think I'll talk about it more.
What it means, how you said, like why labor law is critical of sustainability. We also don't know in your ways. We also don't know like the historical trajectory that you mentioned, but did not even. Like you didn't. How do you say? You just mentioned, but you do not flesh it out. So it's important, even for this case, that we know about these things. Even for you to situate what the case that you're making, it's important that we know about these things.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do it next time. Use my full 40 minutes.
Anybody else? Well, we can continue over lunch.
Yeah.
I have a few comments here. Many were already anticipated by the rest of the group. So, okay. So maybe then just to follow up what your comment, no? Of course, she couldn't know earlier what our interests were, it's complicated.
Read minds.
So, yeah. But anyway, we have very good friends and they're associated with the group. For example, Professor Stefania Barca, who is in the University of Santiago. She wrote a book, Forces of Reproduction, Connecting Labor and Environment. So maybe if you want to have an idea of the kind of discussion also connected to degrowth and post-growth. She's probably a very good kind of reference. And then there is also another friend that's called Emanuele Leonardi. He's like more eco-Marxist, eco-socialist. He did a lot of work on trying to combine this idea of limits and sustainability with labor, especially with the historical analysis of unions, trade unions in Italy, and in general in Europe, connecting to the work of the goals that are connected also to the unions. Just to, if you want to have an idea what post-growth, degrowth community is doing in terms of labor and sustainability, labor and environment.
Yeah.
And then I have like a lot of micro questions and curiosity about fishing, but I don't know, maybe just I will select a couple of them.
Okay.
The technology arguments, we already discussed it. In terms of the labor in Galicia connected to the fishing industry, there is not only, and I'm pretty sure that you are aware about it, is that you are aware. There is not only the big industry, so not only the big fishing industry, but there is a lot of artisanal. I don't know how to say it.
You can say artisanal. Yeah,
small scale fishing, and what for example, what I see, I was a couple of years ago, I was super interested in the work of the redeiras, that are the women that traditionally maintain and repair nets, and I was in a workshop with them. They have an organization, sort of NGO in Aguarda, which is the last village before Portugal, and they told me that now the big maintenance is carried out by migrants, Senegal, maybe Africa. So they are like, there is also this aspect. It's not just fishing, but also like all the industry that's connected to maintenance. Yeah. That is also like being externalized to migrants. Maybe, I don't know if you have time, but maybe you can look at that aspect as well. And then I was like curious about the relation between the very strict regulation, like quotas and stuff like that, and the tremendous impact of illegal fishing, not only in the big scale, but also the local scale. Because if you go to Cangas, if you many places around Vigo, you see like big houses. They were built with the illegal fishing, but not like industrial fishing, like local small scale pirate fishing. Okay. And because to me it's like, it seems that we always idealize the local fishing and they are good. But in my experience, because I'm like I love fishing, I spend a lot of time on the sea. The biggest furtivo, no? It's called furtivo. Are the locals, small scale fishermen. They are like, and completely changed my perspective, because when I arrived here, I was convinced that the big problem was the industry, the big industry. But now that I discovered that a lot of illegal fishing is done by the so-called artisanal craft fishing. And if you talk to, for example, I can give you a contact with one of the guy that is working with Elena Aritz. Okay. You know him.
I've seen his work, yeah.
He can tell you a lot of things about that. And actually they are also the ones that are pushing national regulation, national law, to criminalize recreational fishing, like angler and spearfishing. Yeah. For example, now they want to ban sea bass fishing in Galicia. And the sea, and the threat of this kind of species specifically is not the angler or spearfishermen, are the local small-scale fishing that is fishing when the fish are reproducing, for example, or spawning. So this was the more comments and questions, but.
Okay. I think on the literature, I use a lot of Stefania Barca's work in my PhD, but Manuel Leonardi not so much. So I'll have a look at his work. And then in terms of the nets, there are a lot of women. I think I've just had to define my scope.
No,
So
of course.
there's so many different aspects of this that I'd love to go down, and I think my supervisors are like, oh God, when I start new projects. But I was talking to a group, they're called Funda Mar. They bring ship owners and people who work in the sector together, and they've started a new project with the woman who fixed the nets. And apparently they were like, what can we do to provide it? And they were like, we just love a massage. And they were like, okay. So now they are like, if that improves your working conditions, we will send you a physiotherapist and we can work with you. And they're all a bit like, okay. But it's interesting to talk to them and their experiences. But it is changing in terms of who's doing that work, the kind of culture around that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, on a local level, there's always these dynamics. You can easily romanticize the local fishermen and that. I don't know a way around it. I think they've been there for centuries, like these people who tend to dominate over others. And you even see that within... I'm not so sure about the artisanal fishing sector in Galicia, but in a lot of different sectors, there's the very small scale fishers, and they can participate in cofradios or whatever, but it's always kind of the big pirates or the big kind of families that kind of dominate the conversation. But I'm not sure how to deal with that. I think because it's been there for so long, surely there's ways like cofradias and other ways to kind of readdress that, but I'm not sure.
And then there is another aspect, that is the fact that at least in Spain or generally in Europe, the consumption of fish is declining, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So this poses a big threat in terms of employment, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yesterday the two ship owners I was talking to, they were like, nobody, like Spain used to be the biggest, I think it's still the biggest consumer of fish, but it's certainly, it's declining, and people just don't feel the need, or a lot of the fish that's bought is imported. So
and then there is a lot of connection, because I'm coming from southern Italy. The fish is not just something that you eat, it's connected to the culture, festival, religious festival, practices, cuisine, cooking. And I see that here, for example, is like really fading with the language. So giving up on the language, and also giving up on a lot of tradition of eating fish that's was central, but now are no longer central, for example. And it's, everybody's buying dorad from Turkey, and nobody's eating the mackerel that is fished here in San Cencio, and
Yeah, I think there is kind of this push to potentially change, like this whole farm to fork strategy and this push for greater food sovereignty, but it's hard. Like the two women I was talking to yesterday were really upset about it, but then one of them, because a lot of her boats fish between Galicia and Ireland, she goes to Ireland a lot, and she said, she was much meaner about it, but she said Ireland has no culture of eating fish, but she says now it's coming back, and she said that might be like it's a very kind of posh thing maybe now, but she's like, before people only ate fish and chips and that's all they cared about with fish, but now there's kind of this more of a culture of understanding the consumption of fish. I'm not sure about that myself, but she spends a lot of time in the ports there in Ireland, so maybe she said there's this kind of turn to re-evaluate how we see it, but it's a lot about consumption in our broader economic model, but
okay. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Conversation. We have Tess online. She's our postdoc. Hello, Tess. Bye.